chapter on grain spawn preparation, I'm going to walk you through the steps that I use, and this works out very well for me. I start out with organic rye berries because that way I'm sure there's no pesticides or fungicides on them. The next step is to measure out our dry grains. If you're using 1 quart jars, you're going to want to measure out 1 cup of grain for each 1 quart jar that you intend to use. If you're using 1 liter jars, measure out 250 milliliters for each 1 liter jar. My pressure sterilizer holds 10 1-quart jars, so I measured out 10 cups of rye berries, and now I'm over here rinsing them in the sink. I'm using hot water, and as I stir it around really well, you can see how brown this water gets. And as we pour it off, you'll see how filthy it is. There's all sorts of pieces of straw and dirt and dust and bugs and everything else in it. And if we fail to rinse this out, all of this dust and dirt will be like glue, and it'll cause our grains to stick together and clump up later. So we're going to rinse this out, we're going to pour the water off, and then repeat the process. Sometimes after the second time the water pours off clear, sometimes it takes 3 or 4 rinses, but we're going to continue to do this until the water pours off clear. Let's watch. Well, it was a little better that time, but you can still see how dirty that water is. In fact, if you look down at the bottom, you can't even see the rye grains through the water. So we're going to need at least 1 more rinse. This is the 3rd rinse, and the water's pouring off pretty clear, so this is going to be the last time we need to rinse it. You can see how much clearer the water fills up after a couple of rinses, and believe me, that will make a big difference later. I'm going to fill this up with hot tap water to begin the soak, and the soak is going to help hydrate the grains, and it makes them a bit softer so that later on when we simmer them, they don't burst any kernels. I'm going to add about a tablespoon of gypsum. That's around 15 milliliters. And the gypsum will also help to keep the grains from clumping up, and it adds calcium and sulfur that are both necessary mushroom nutrients. After anywhere from about a 4 to 24 hour soak, just put your pot of water on the stove and bring it to a boil. I like to boil the water first before draining it because that will help to steam off the excess moisture from the surface of the grains. It's pretty important if you have plastic plumbing like I do, run some cold water in the sink as you pour this boiling water down it so you don't damage your pipes. You can see water only drains out the bottom for about a minute or so, but the grains are still really too wet. So this is where having them hot and steamy comes in handy. You'll see that as I shake the colanders, a lot of steam rises off, and the steam is going to help dry the rye berries on the surface because the moisture we need is inside. We don't want any surface moisture because if we load our jars with wet grains, over the next few days, that excess water is going to drain down to the bottom of the jars, and we don't want any excess liquid in our jars. Now, this is what your grains should look like when they're ready to load. You can see none of them are stuck together. The grains are loose. There's no visible moisture on them at all, yet they're fully hydrated. Now, here's one more test you can do. Put about a tablespoon or so on a piece of toilet paper, and I've got some dry grains sitting here next to it for comparison to the size for you. Leave that for about 15 seconds on the toilet paper and then dump it off, and there should not be a wet spot. If there's a wet spot on the toilet paper, then your grains are too wet. Well, it's time to load our jars now, and I actually like to use a spoon to load it. I've got one of those canning funnels, but I always end up pouring a little bit too much through it because it's hard to regulate, and then I got to pour some back and everything else, and it's really just as fast to use a spoon. You want to fill your jars no more than about 2/3 full, because we will have to shake them later, and especially if you're going to use these for grain-to-grain transfers and you have to add more grains to them, you definitely don't want them being too full. Well, as the title to this section indicates, we have to provide some means of gas exchange to our jars so that the mycelium can breathe as it colonizes. This is going to involve putting lids on our jars with holes in them so that the gases can exchange, but at the same time our rye grains have to be kept totally sterile, so this is going to involve putting a filter in the lid. I'm going to show you a few ways of making up your jar lids in order to accomplish this filtered gas exchange. This first method is my preferred choice, and it involves using the synthetic filter discs that are commercially available from the various mushroom supply outlets. These filter discs are manufactured to fit the regular and wide-mouth mason jar lids. You want to put the filter disc in first because this positions it on the outside of the jar where it'll stay dry. I found over the years if you put the filter disc on the inside where it's exposed to the wet grains, the filter itself will get damp, and a damp filter will be able to allow bacteria and molds to colonize right through it. So you want to be sure and put the filter disc into the jar ring first. The next step is to take one of your regular mason jar lids, the metal lid itself, and drill 3 to 4 small holes in it. I use 1/16 inch holes, roughly 1 millimeter, and this is plenty for the gas exchange. Then you want to position the metal lid into the jar ring also, and I use it with the metal side down. That makes a good enough seal against the glass because the air and the gases are going to exchange through the path of least resistance, which will be through the holes and through the filter. We're not really worried about a tight seal, so we don't need to put rubber side down the way we would if we were canning peaches, for example, where we needed to create a vacuum. A very simple variation on this method that many growers are using today is to buy Tyvek. You can either get it from one of the kite building supply houses, or if you go to your local home mega center, very often in the paint department you can find Tyvek coveralls, and they're really economical. You can bring them home and cut some squares of Tyvek that you can put down. And in a case like this, you want to put your lid down on the jar first, then put your square of Tyvek over that. Then you can screw the ring right down over the Tyvek and let the Tyvek get caught between the threads in the jar ring. If you use this method, the Tyvek is pretty thin. I would recommend that you double it up, but this is also a very effective way to get filtered gas exchange. Now, this next method I want to show you might be a better way for those of you working without a laminar flow hood. These are homemade lids made from plastic lids, and you will see the individual took a synthetic filter disc pictured in the bottom right, and after drilling a few small holes in his plastic lid, cut the filter disc and made a patch to go over the top and glued that on. You drill roughly a 1/4 inch hole, and then you get these rubber injection ports. They're available from medical supply outlets, and you put the injection port into the hole you've drilled. And this gives you a method that you can then inoculate your jars with commercially prepared either spore syringes or liquid mycelium syringes. One more method I want to show you today is the use of synthetic pillow stuffing to make a filter. In this case, you're going to want to drill a larger hole in your lid, and be sure and ream it out, as you can see I'm doing here. What happens when you drill these larger holes, it tends to make burrs on the lid, and I guarantee you're going to cut your finger if you don't get in there and ream it out a little bit. Just tear off a wad of the pillow stuffing and stick it through the hole in the lid, and there you have your filter. You can put it on either rubber side down or metal side down, your choice. And this method also works well for people without a laminar flow hood, because you can take either a spore syringe or a commercially available mycelium syringe, and you can inject right through this filter material and right into your jars. One last step we have to take before we can pressure cook the jars is to put aluminum foil over the top. The only reason we do this is because during the pressure cooking cycle, water condenses on the lid of our pressure cooker or sterilizer and then rains down during the entire process onto the top of our jars. If we failed to cover them with foil, the water that drips down from the lid would get right through the filter, right through the holes, and it will ruin the moisture content we worked so hard to get perfect. One very important step you want to take before you load the pressure cooker, especially if you're using one of these with a metal-to-metal seal, put a very small bead of petroleum jelly on your finger and then rub it around the edges right on the sealing surface. It doesn't take much, just a small dab, but this lubricates the lid as it sits down into place and really makes it easier to get off later. The pressure cooker I'm using is the All-American 921. It holds 7 quart jars standing upright on the bottom. Since we don't have any liquid in our jars, feel free to lay 3 additional ones sideways on top, and that lets you put 10 jars in the cooker. Once you have your jars loaded into the pressure cooker, put it on the stove and turn the burner on high to bring up the heat. Leave the weight off if you're using a pressure cooker, or the toggle valve open if you're using a sterilizer, and when the water begins to boil and steam starts to escape, allow that steam to escape for about 5 to 10 minutes, and that will heat up the entire surface of the pressure cooker and the jars. At that point, put the weight on or close the toggle valve and allow pressure to build. Now, once pressure reaches 15 pounds per square inch or 100 kPa, start your timer at that point and allow it to sit for 90 minutes at full pressure. When the timer sounds, don't do anything to your pressure cooker. Simply turn off the stove and walk away. Allow your pressure cooker to cool naturally and slowly. I usually try to set it up so that I cook at night and shut the pressure cooker off just as I'm going to bed. And then the next morning the jars have cooled down and they're ready to take out and inoculate. You can allow your pressure cooker or sterilizer to cool overnight. There's no reason to open it up while the jars are still hot. Many times growers who prepare their grains improperly have found they have to open it up right after the pressure drops in order to shake the jars. But if you prepare them this way, you can wait until they're room temperature, and as you can see when I turn the jar upside down, the kernels just separate. There's no shaking required. If you follow the steps outlined in this chapter, your grains will come out nice and loose like this every single time, even when you allow them to cool overnight. And this is something that a lot of even very experienced growers have a hard time with. So pardon me while I rub it into them. Step number 1, rinse your grains very well. Fill up the pot with water, swirl it around, pour it out, and repeat until clear. This is very, very important. It's what makes your grains nice and loose and fluffy later. The second step is to give your grains a nice long soak. This has a couple of purposes actually. Number 1, it hydrates your grains very slowly so that you don't end up with any burst kernels. Don't forget the gypsum. The gypsum helps to keep your grains loose and from sticking, and also provides calcium. The other purpose for the soak is it germinates those bacterial endospores so that they get killed off real easily in sterilization. Step number 3, the boil, drain, and shake. We boil for a couple of reasons. One, it finishes hydrating the grains if they're not already fully hydrated. Number 2, it gets them good and hot so that when we pour them into the strainer, what water does not drain through the bottom, when we shake it, it will evaporate off as steam. That gets the outside of our grains dry. This is what you want your grains to look like before you load your jars. Note there's no excess moisture whatsoever, and as I run my fingers through it, it's not sticky and none of the grains are clumping up. One more test you can make is the toilet paper test. A small handful of grains on toilet paper for 15 seconds should leave no wet spot. Step number 4, gas exchange. Very, very important. I help growers all the time, and they've had a jar of mycelium that gets to about 50% colonized and then just stalls out. The reason is they did not provide for gas exchange. So I showed you synthetic filter discs. Those are my personal favorite because you can just reuse them over and over again for years. I have some that have been through hundreds of cycles. I showed you how to use the injection port lids. Those are great for when you don't have a laminar flow hood. Another alternative is taking the pillow stuffing and making lids from that. Tyvek, get a paint suit from your local Mega Mart and cut it into 100 pieces and make filters out of that. Whatever you use, don't forget to put the foil on before you pressure cook. That will keep your filter dry and keep your grain moisture content right. And finally, step number 5 in the process, we are going to sterilize our jars at 15 psi, 100 kPa for 90 minutes. And when we remove the jars the next day after they're completely cooled down to room temperature, all we'll have to do is turn the jars upside down as you saw, and every kernel will separate from every other kernel. Now it's your turn. Happy growing!